All right, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started, shall we? So welcome back to the new Buddhism in Translation Sunday night class. We started a new format, a kind of a new course or a new class last week, last Sunday. We're just doing a more kind of informal conversation discussion about Buddhism in general or specific. We're just sort of a anything goes kind of a situation. Um, However, I did start last week, I started talking about something, and so I think I'm just going to kind of pick up there. Um, Although I did receive a few questions during the week that I'm going to hopefully answer or make attempts to answer. So I'm going to start tonight with a sort of uh, a new theme, but it's the same theme as last time. So the theme from last time was what is Buddhism, right? So this new class is translating Buddhism. What are we translating? Like, what is this thing that is Buddhism? And I sort of presented it in a very traditional way last week by talking about how Buddhism is traditionally understood as a three-part tradition. One part called Shila or Sīla, moral discipline, morality. One part Samādhi or meditation, and one part Panya or Prajñā, wisdom. And we didn't get to talk about Prajñā last time, so we're going to get to that tonight. But I want to back up. And tonight, the way that I want to kind of frame the conversation, it's still what is Buddhism, but I want to put it in the kind of context of, is Buddhism a religion? A classic question that comes up a lot. So I want to kind of just start with that as a new way of approaching this question of what is Buddhism. It is, of course, by many people, Buddhism is considered a religion. It is up there with the other world religions. I studied Buddhism in a world religions department or a religion department, and so we can pretty safely say it's a religion. I would even go so far as to say it's kind of the original religion, actually. And we can talk about this as much or as little as you like, but there's a lot of things about Buddhism that are rather unique in the history of religion, in the history of these traditions. And one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that, Buddhism's pretty old, right? It's from about 500 BC or so. And something that we don't kind of talk a lot about, or at least I don't talk a lot about it, is the Buddha or Buddhism. It made some decisions or it did something. Again, whether it was the Buddha or this kind of Buddhist tradition, but for a long time before the Buddha, people were meditating, people were doing all kinds of practices. But the Buddha did a few things that were rather unique. One thing that he did that, as far as I've studied, had never been done before, a uniform. In the world of Buddhism, what made a Buddhist is that they wore the same clothing, had the same haircut, they walked the same, they talked the same. It was an entire culture in that way. And that was new Again, as far as I can tell, nobody else was doing uniforms. If you were going off to the woods to meditate or be a yogi, that's just what you were doing. But the Buddha sort of created this kind of community around this. So that's an aspect of a kind of religion. But what really makes Buddhism a religion is the first of that three-part teaching that we were talking about last week. So the Shila. So this idea of the first division of the teaching, I want to just talk about it just a little bit more. And then we're going to move on to a deeper conversation about meditation. And then hopefully we get to that third category tonight. But a few things about the first category or the first aspect of Buddhism, this idea of being moral or like following moral precepts. I want to remind you that in the world of Buddhism, there's sort of the minimal amount of Sīla or Shila, and you can get kind of more and more and more. And what I mean by that is that at the kind of minimal, there are these five precepts, and they are precepts about killing, stealing and lying, sex and drugs, and then if you're really serious, you could add in rock and roll. And I want to talk about that in a moment. But so these five precepts, again, are killing, stealing, lying, and then intoxication and sexuality. So those are the five. And I wanted to mention something about each of those a little bit. One of the things, and this is I'm kind of pulling or drawing off of things I said last week. So I'll try to repeat myself when it's necessary, but we did a lot of talking, or I did a bit of talking, and I did a lot of talking about, well, what the Buddhists call afflictions, kleshas, things like getting angry, a desire, even addiction, right? And then the third is ignorance. So greed, anger, delusion, or greed, anger, ignorance. Those are the three kind of root problems in that way. And the thing about it is that the prohibition or the recommendation to avoid killing, it's very much about hostility, anger, violence. And so I just want you to recognize that the the precept against killing, it matches and fits with this desire to get rid of anger. And noticing that if you're kind of in the business of killing, you're in the business of perpetuating violence, destruction, and anger in that way. So I want us to notice how that particular precept around killing has to do with this affliction. Similarly, stealing is, of course, about desire. Oh, you mean you want it so bad, you're going to even steal it? So we notice that stealing is a problem, but it's a problem from a Buddhist point of view because of its desire. It's out of control desire. While we're talking about desire, let's talk about sexuality because that's one of the five precepts. Now, one of the things that I've been trying to do in this Buddhism in translation class, at least I started doing it last week, I want to make clear that there are many different ways of being Buddhist. And not only that, there is very, very old, almost archaic ways of being Buddhist. There's more medieval ways of being Buddhist. and there's very modern ways of being Buddhist. Okay. In the early days of Buddhism, like when the Buddha was around, it does seem like what it meant to be a Buddhist was to renounce, but renounce the home life, as it's called. So this is relinquishing the home and basically taking a vow of homelessness in that way, of not owning a home, moving around. You also renounced basically clothing and you would wear the uniform. You would renounce your hair, shaving your head every 2 weeks. You renounced a lot of things. And the one big thing that you renounced in the early days of Buddhism, or as a renunciant, is you renounced sexuality. Now, that, of course, is the vow of celibacy, and that is what makes a monk or a nun a monk or a nun. There's many other things that make a monk or a nun a monk or a nun, but one big one is the vow of absolute celibacy. That was sort of the original program of Buddhism, was basically no sexuality at all. And in particular, what we want to make clear, I would like to make this clear, we as Buddhists in that way, this monastic renunciatory type of Buddhist, it's not just intercourse that we are focused on. We are actually very focused on orgasms, male and female, and not having them. Now, what we're talking about, though, is, and let me kind of make this very, very clear. This is my understanding, my way of teaching Buddhism. But one of the things that I appreciate about Buddhism is that it is not that sexuality is bad or evil or anything like that. What it is that it is a form of pleasure. It's a form of pleasure that comes from something, whether it comes from either intercourse or masturbation or whatever. And what the idea is that we want to be very aware of desire and and pleasure, and in particular, like the problem of pleasure that comes from something. This is what we talked about last week. And the Buddha seems to have noticed a couple of major problems with pleasure that comes from things. And so the problem is that if sexuality or the orgasm or whatever is the pleasure, if you start to get pleasure that way, and that's your like your go-to way of being happy, the problem with that is when you can't have it or can't do it or it's inappropriate to do it or what have you, you are now frustrated because you would like to be pleased, but you can't. So now all of a sudden, the source of pleasure is now the source of suffering. And then I mentioned this last week, there's another problem with the sort of like, I'm bored or I feel bad. I know, I know a way to feel happy. So what happens is that you can become conditioned into using that or needing that in order to be pleased. And what happens is that you you become, and I haven't said it, so let me say it. I understand the Buddha, I understand Buddhism as talking about a much greater form of pleasure that comes from not needing anything, from actually being totally cool. Like, I'm good, I'm cool, I don't need anything. And the thing about it is that that type of pleasure, from a Buddhist point of view, is a sustainable pleasure. It is, again, a much greater pleasure. But if you keep getting pleasure from things, you will become conditioned and dependent upon things, thus cutting yourself off from the ability to just be pleased naturally, right? So again, the problem is not, it's not that sexuality is evil or bad. It's that we can get addicted to it like anything else. And then at that point, it starts to become a drag. It starts to become not pleasure. So the original Buddhist prescription was just to avoid it altogether. But if in the more kind of, I would say, definitely the modern form of Buddhism, but even going back centuries and centuries and centuries, the general idea was to basically be very careful with your sensuality or your sexuality, meaning try not to become dependent on masturbating to be happy and pleased in that way. And then, of course, I kind of often like to mention or point out that if you are a layperson, and especially if you are in a relationship with somebody, then the real problem of sexuality would be seeking or taking that outside of the relationship. We know that that can destroy a relationship, and that's where sexuality is tricky stuff. So, the basic idea is if you're a monk or a nun, you don't have sex at all and you don't go anywhere near it. And if you're a householder, you be very careful with it. Be very kind, loving, compassionate with that. So, once again, though, I'm putting that in the category of desire along with stealing in that way. So, stealing can be excessive desire or expression of excessive desire, and sexuality can be overly desirous in that sense. Everybody okay with that? No?
I've accumulated three questions.
Oh, good. Excellent.
My first question is what you were just talking about, just because you were just talking about it, which is a lot of times I hear the prohibition or the precept about sexuality framed as not causing harm with sexuality, which, that's a very nice way to frame it. I'm not a celibate monastic, and I don't think anyone else is here too. And you've already talked about those differences, but just then it seems to go from the category of desire to the category of non-harming.
Mm.
So I just wanted to, I don't know if you have any comments about that, but then I have two other questions.
Yeah, on that one, I didn't mention it. I will. So I I like to think of all the prohibition, all five precepts. It's interesting if you look at them using the language of taking, meaning we talk about the avoiding of the taking of life. Like that's a
Mhm.
way of talking about killing is taking life. So don't take life. Don't take what has not been given, right? And then you could talk about taking drugs or taking intoxicants. And I would suggest thinking about it as a prohibition against taking sexuality,
Mm, mm,
like taking it.
Mm.
If it's been offered by your lover, by a partner, and it's like offered freely, that's not taking. That's receiving the gift in that way.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think that there is a place for avoiding harm, of course,
Yeah,
absolutely.
right.
But for me, sexuality brings up more problems around the desire situation. So,
Thank you. And is it meaningful? This is a follow-up to that, that not causing harm is the first precept, like in a way, it's like the overarching precept, you know.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah. And so I had a question about that. You were talking about not killing as being because of the avoidance of violence. And I just want to ask if that is as distinguished from what some people or religions ascribe, like there's a sacredness, killing other people, there's a sacredness to life, or even other beings. And that's not part of the Buddhist prohibition against it. Is that true?
Excellent. No, excellent. So you you're bringing it back to my umbrella idea of like, is Buddhism a religion?
Yeah.
And I'm really glad you did that because I wanted to mention something. So I'm doing that thing where it sounds like I didn't hear Gnome at all, and I'm like totally going over here, but I'm getting there. So I wanted to mention about like as a religion, which again, most people are fairly in agreement that Buddhism is a religion, but as a religion, what's it all about? Like, what is it a religion of or whatever? And I would suggest that it is a religion of the alleviation of suffering, maybe individual suffering, maybe global world suffering, but nonetheless, it is about alleviating suffering. Now, Noam just mentioned that many of world religions have a prohibition against killing. It is one of the Ten Commandments. It's in every holy book. And Noam also mentioned that in many traditions, the prohibition against killing is because of a kind of sacrality around life. And I wouldn't, I, it's not that Buddhism doesn't think life is sacred. Life is definitely sacred in that way. But part of what I started talking about last week, or when I was talking about the precepts last week, I had mentioned that there's kind of two ways to follow the precepts in Buddhism. You can do it just sort of like as a good, obedient Buddhist who follows the precepts because Buddha said I should follow the precepts. But I also presented that if you actually look at these precepts, like from a kind of Buddhist perspective, you'll notice that what they're doing is actually saving us from ourselves. Like, and that's where I want to get back to like, what is Buddhism? It is definitely a tradition about alleviating suffering. But as you all know, and I know all of you in here know this, it is a deeply psychologically based tradition, meaning it is so focused on the inner workings of the mind and understanding that we are causing ourselves a great amount of suffering. And so the tradition is about alleviating that suffering and noticing that we behave in certain ways where it's like it's very narrow, short-sighted in that way. Where it's this idea of like, well, I just want it, so I'm going to steal it without actually understanding the long-term karmic consequences of that behavior, right? So there's a way in which the Buddha recognized that we're very impetuous instinctual, habitual beings, but then are just causing ourselves suffering as a result. So these prohibitions are actually just trying to do us a favor. And at that point, it's definitely not about, these coming from Brahma or coming from God. They're coming from a human being that figured out, like, oh, these instinctual behaviors are actually causing my own suffering. So that's my answer to that one, Gnome, about killing.
Thank you. That's a great answer. I
Oh,
love it.
yay.
And I have one more question, and
Yeah.
this one may be more straightforward, is what could monks or can monks have like they can't have sex, they're celibate, but can they have special friends? I don't know. Can they have like romantic relationships or is that,
Yep. So on that, I'll dive down a little deeper. I'm just making a few notes. So last week I mentioned nirvana, and I mentioned nirvana as being a technical term, a technical Buddhist term for when those three afflictions that we just talked about of greed, anger, and confusion or delusion or ignorance. We talked about, or last week I talked about how those three things, greed, anger, and delusion, sometimes we're really angry, sometimes we're not so angry. Sometimes we're really desirous, sometimes we're not so desirous. But they kind of come and go. And then we might get into a nice meditative state and they might subside. But then as soon as we're out of the meditative state, they come back. But I mentioned that the definition or a definition of nirvana is when those three things, greed, anger, and delusion, have actually ceased completely. I mention this because in the early Buddhist tradition, there was, and again, this was for both men and women, but there was, and there is, because this is still a part of the tradition, there is this understanding that, well, as wild as this may sound, there is an understanding that it is possible to completely eradicate the sex drive to the point where men no longer get erections, to the point where there's no more orgasms ever in that way. Now, I mention this because it's just, again, it's a part of the tradition that for the monastics that are going for that hardcore goal, there is this understanding that you can actually bring the sex drive and then diminish it completely. So there's that. And then Noam asked about, okay, well, let's say they're subsiding their sexual energy or sexual drive, but what about a kind of partnership, intimacy? Is that right, Noam? Something like that. And let me put it to you this way. As usual, this is just the way that I understand it. But from a lot of the sutras and Buddhist things that I've read, there is a problem with having like a lover or a one person who you are intimate with. And what it is that there's a way in which the monastic, at least, and maybe the bodhisattva, but the bodhisattva and the monastic in that sense are working on trying to see all sentient beings as their dearest, most intimate friend. And there's a way in which if we have an actual dearest, most intimate friend, we might privilege them over other, not in a, nefarious bad way, but so for the hardcore gnome, who are going for that goal. I want to, that's my answer to monks having special friends.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. It actually illuminates some things I've thought about in my own
Okay.
relationships. But
Oh,
thank you
good.
so much. Yeah.
Okay. So, no killing, no stealing. And then stealing, we also talked about sexuality. So now we just have to talk about lying, falsehood in that way, and intoxication. So both of those, if you ask me, have to do with delusion or ignorance or confusion. Moha, the third klesha. So let's start with lying, because the idea is, well, basically, the idea is if you're lying, yeah, you're very confused. And, the Buddha has a beautiful line. It's in a sutra. It's one of my favorite lines. The Buddha says that a liar only lies to themselves. That's all that's happening there. So, in other words, like this idea of like, I know I'll lie to this person and I'll tell them that, like, whatever, I'm a famous artist when I'm really not a famous artist. Yeah, that'll do it. It's just confusion. You're just confusing yourself even more. So the idea of like, again, falsehood or lying and thinking that it's advantageous, that's a problem. And then because we're talking about confusion or delusion, that's the Buddha, as far as I know, that's the Buddha's big problem with inebriation. So with intoxication or with drinking, it clouds the mind that is already confused. So the mind's already confused, wondering what's going on? Why am I suffering like this? I know, I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out this way. No, that's really truly adding fuel to the fire in that way. So I want to make it clear that from everything I've read, from everywhere I've looked, the prohibition is very much against things that stupefy. So alcohol is the main problem, and the fifth prohibition or that the fifth precept is against alcohol. But the problem with it is the cloudy confusion in that way. So any other drugs in that way that stupefy probably would qualify as well. All right. And then I joked and I said, those are the five precepts, right? Killing, stealing, lying, sex, and drugs. And then I joked, but if you're serious, no rock and roll. And I say that as a joke, but what I mean by that is you may know that there's the five precepts, but then there's sometimes the 10 precepts. And those extra five precepts are things like sleeping on a high bed, going to the theater or going to entertainment and seeing entertainment. That's why I joke about the rock and roll in that way. It's other things like wearing jewelry, wearing adornments, things like that. And basically, those extra five precepts, again, they are for renunciants, they are for monks and nuns, and sometimes they are for lay people during a period of renunciation. So, meaning you might go on a retreat for like a 10-day retreat, and then you would take the 10 precepts as a layperson. And during the retreat, you're sleeping on the ground, you're not wearing any kind of makeup or jewelry or anything like that. But then after the retreat, you go back to just following the first five. So I wanted to say that about, or I wanted to joke about the rock and roll. I wanted to joke about all of that, but only to reinforce something. And what I'm doing, by the way, I'm ooching us towards a talk about meditation. So I don't encourage people to renounce. I am not a renunciant. I don't encourage people to renounce. But I do often encourage people to entertain the notion of renouncing. And what I mean by that is that when I say things, or when we talk about like sleeping on a tall bed or whatever it might be, right? I know sometimes we can hear that and we would jump, maybe like irrationally, we would jump all the way to the idea of giving it up for life, forever. And I would suggest don't do that. Don't in your mind pretend to renounce something forever for life. I would encourage sort of this considering, like, could I go without that? Maybe for a week. I'll go back to it in a week. I'll go back to the rock and roll in a week. But like, why couldn't I give it up for a week? And again, I'm not telling anybody to do this. I'm just encouraging you to think it out in your mind of your relationship to these things. That's all. Okay. So that's my way of approaching the precepts in that way. Do out of wisdom, right? Not out of blind adherence to the Buddha or anything. Okay, Jenny Doll.
Yeah, but you could just fill in the blank with anything, like rock and roll. Could be meditation, could be yoga, could be taking a walk.
Indeed, and that's going to lead me, Jenny. That comment is leading me exactly to where I want to go with meditation. So, the next category, the next division of the Buddhist teachings it's usually Samādhi, right? But we're talking about meditation. Last week, I gave a whole quick rundown of the Buddhist meditation program, that it all begins with something called sati or mindfulness, specifically mindfulness of the body, and I'm going to return to that in a moment. But I walked us through these four foundations of mindfulness in order to get into these four jhanic states, in order to get into these four samadhis. I want to kind of simplify everything. So, insofar as Buddhism is a religion, it is definitely this part that makes it a very interesting religion. This whole meditation thing, this is a very, very interesting component to Buddhism in that way. Like, what are we doing? What? Like the morality thing, all of that morality, I understand that. I understand it on a personal level. I understand it in the social contract, that idea of like just it makes sense for the social cohesion. But when it comes to this category of meditation, what are we doing? Well, if you ask me, meditation is practicing not needing anything. We're not good at it. And we're actually addicted to stimuli. We are addicted to visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, all the stimuli. And what happens is that when we deprive this habituated thing, when we deprive it of things to look at and things to listen to and things to eat and things to smell, it gets bored and it gets antsy and it starts to look for some source of pleasure because it's conditioned to depend upon things for pleasure. So, again, if you ask me, meditation is practicing not needing anything. So, that's my first thing I'm going to say about meditation. Here's the next thing that I want to say about meditation. There's many, many, many different ways of meditating. right? But this Buddhist way is very interesting. And what it is that it is this very, and I made it way too complicated last week, I realize. It really begins with this body awareness. And I got a long question from Robin about meditation, and I'm going to do my best. She had many, many aspects to her question, so I'm going to try to get to some of them. So, the first thing that I kind of want to emphasize is that in the early form of Buddhism, like from everything that I can tell, the earliest form of Buddhist meditation was definitely a, a process or a system of sensory deprivation, of sensory withdrawal. And so, what I mean is that the theme or this thing that I keep saying about pleasure being derived from things and that we are habituated or conditioned to need things, varieties of things. Well, one way to decondition or recondition or uncondition the mind is to stop looking at things. In other words, close your eyes. And indeed, many forms of meditation encourage you to shut your eyes. Some traditions have open-eyed meditation. I would not encourage that at the moment. That that's for like advanced meditators in a certain way. Just close your eyes. Make sure the room's quiet, right? So find a quiet place, close your eyes. Maybe, in terms of smell or taste, those should be pretty neutral as it is, but just try to keep those pretty neutral. So now you're not seeing anything. There's nothing to really listen to. There's nothing to really smell. There's nothing, no flavors. So now we only have two things going on: the body and the mind. Now, most of us are perhaps, or many of us perhaps, struggle with an overactive mind. Meaning in meditation, a lot of thoughts come up, and the mind maybe is racing, maybe the mind is moving towards depressed modes of thought. Many different things can happen. So we're going to talk about the mind in a moment. The mind is sort of the big problem in that way. But in order to properly deal with that, we want to start with the body. So what I'm getting at is that if your eyes are closed and your ears and nose and tongue are closed, then you really kind of only have those two focuses. And the Buddha suggested to bring all of your attention to the body at first. So now if your eyes are closed, you are just moving into this kind of awareness of the body. But the thing that I want you to think about is that, yeah, we want to kind of be exploring the body as far as like being mindful of the body. But there's also something really important going on here. You're using the body as an anchor for your attention and your mind. So what I mean is that your mind, the mind, is going to have a tendency to dart around, and I mentioned this last week, that the mind can dart around to the past. It can dart forward to tomorrow and the future. It can dart around to other rooms in your house and wondering what's going on over there, what's going on over there. But the way to reel in the mind, to reel it in from yesterday, to reel it in from tomorrow, the way of bringing the mind in is by focusing your attention on the body and just keep bringing your attention back to the body, in particular, the breathing. So remember, breath awareness or anapanasati, breathing, breath meditation, it is body meditation. It's it's specifically your lungs in that way. So what I suggest for meditation, so this is, I have a couple things to say about meditation, but the first thing is just keep coming back to awareness of the body. And awareness of the body is really about a kind of, I call it a gentle curiosity, meaning you are very gently curious about your whole body in that way, from your toes all the way to the top of your head. And you really just want to be open to the bodily experience. And once again, if you find that you're thinking about tomorrow, you find that you're regretting things from yesterday, you just bring it back to the breath. You bring it back to the body. And the thing about the body is, it's always there. You've always got it. You're always breathing. So, no matter where you are, no matter what's going on, you can always return to the breath. So, I suggest not even worrying about jhanas and all of that right now, and really just doing the body meditation. Now, I have one more important thing to say about all of this meditation. I've shared this with many of you. Many of you have heard this from me before, but I think it's something that's worth repeating. And what it is it's something that happened to me many, many years ago that that tremendously affected my meditation practice. I would say it was actually a complete 180-degree turn. And what it is that for years and years and years, I meditated like a good Buddhist, right? But of course, what it was is that I was, setting timers and I was doing the practices and I was either, following whatever it was, but I had trouble, like probably all of you have trouble in that way, but I just struggled with meditation. I struggled with finishing a full session, all of that. And then I had this complete 180 flip. And what it was that, and it's a little hard to describe in a way, but it was that I realized that if I was going to be a good Buddhist, and if I was going to have a good meditation in that way, well, then a good meditator and a good meditation session, I shouldn't be, worried about whatever, or I shouldn't be strategizing. I shouldn't be doing all of these things. And then I realized, oh, that means that when I set this 30-minute timer, that means for the next 30 minutes, I'm off the hook. I don't have to worry about any of this stuff. In fact, I would be a good Buddhist and a good meditator if I didn't worry about this stuff for the next 30 minutes. And if I really let all the emails just whatever, and all of a sudden, I wanted to start meditating for 45 minutes because, you mean all I get to do is just sit and be? So, in other words, I was trying too hard. I was like, no, we're trying too hard the other 23 hours and 30 minutes of the day. That's when we're struggling and trying and trying. So for the 30 minutes of meditation, stop trying. Stop worrying about it for a minute. So that's my little like pep talk of like, you can do it too, as far as that when I had that shift that it wasn't a chore to meditate, but it was actually like a tremendous privilege. It again, I started extending my sessions in that way. So, and I hope that that kind of lines up with everything I've been saying about independent joy, the joy that's not coming from anything, and cultivating that in meditation. So, okay. I'm not done talking about meditation, but I want to ask, and Robin, feel free to throw anything out. I have a few things that I want to mention from your email, but please jump in if anything comes to mind. Anybody, inquiries or ideas about meditation? All right. Well, then I'm going to, oh, I didn't even realize what time it was. So I'm going to mention a few things from Robin's email. She wrote me a lovely email asking a few things about meditation. I think I might have already answered a few things here and there, but so the one part about Robin's email that I want to talk about, because I think it's really important, it's very interesting too. I think the way that I would put it is if we're going to meditate with our eyes open, in other words, if we're going to engage with the external world in meditation, a, a few of Robin's questions were sort of about the meditator's disposition towards sensory experience and towards the world. Am I getting that right, Robin? You would ask this question in terms of, yeah, so, and in particular, Robin was asking about the physical experience of all of this and asking whether this sort of either the physical experience or the external stimuli, whether it should be seen as good, bad, or neutral. And I thought that that was a very kind of interesting way of asking the question because it actually depends on what kind of Buddhism you're practicing. I would say, I would suggest that the early form of Buddhism that is preserved in the modern day Theravada tradition, right? So we know that there's that one outlier of a tradition that's, from way back in the time of the Buddha. And it's sometimes called the Hinayana, the little vehicle. But in that particular school, and by the way, we are segueing to the third category of Buddhism, the wisdom, the Panya or the Prajñā. And what it is that, by the way, I'm segueing right now, but we're going to go back to talk about meditation in a second. So, because of time, I want to introduce this final category. So, this is about something called Prajñā. It's kind of like it's translated as wisdom. It's kind of like higher knowledge, over knowledge, this kind of like idea of transcendent knowledge or transcendent wisdom. And this is definitely a place that the different kinds of Buddhism in the world understand wisdom or prajñā differently. It's definitely the place that you see the most difference in the different schools of Buddhism. So for a little while, I'm going to be only talking about the original old school Hinayana Theravada way of thinking about wisdom. In the original form of Buddhism, there were a lot of different ways of understanding this wisdom, but it all kind of boiled down to a certain way of seeing the world. And this, in the early form of Buddhism, wisdom. Oh, and by the way, the reason why I'm doing this, I just remembered. Robin's email, it referenced she used a phrase, and it's a phrase that you see a lot in the world of Buddhism. In fact, you see it a lot in a lot of places. And what it is, it's the language of seeing things as they really are. That's sometimes how people define prajñā. It is seeing things as they really are. That's what wisdom is. And I think that that's a little bit, the language there is a little misleading. And what I mean by that is the language of seeing things as they really are, that language of seeing things is misleading because it's kind of like, how should I see them? And it's actually about understanding things as they really are. So, from the early Buddhist point of view, there is something called the three characteristics of existence. Normally, it's called the three marks of existence, but I don't like that language of marks. So, it's the three lakshana, the three characteristics of existence, of reality. And it's this idea that the right view, the right wisdom, the right way of seeing the world. And by the way, remember, I'm talking about early Buddhism. The right way of seeing the world is, first of all, you want to see everything as actually causing suffering. And this lines up with what I've been saying about dependent joy. The teaching of suffering, the noble truth of suffering, if you ask me, is not that life is suffering or everything is suffering, or, there's a lot of people, a lot of different teachings about what that means. For me, the teaching of suffering is about understanding that if you're looking at something thinking, yeah, that'll make me happy, think again. So that's the idea, my understanding of the first mark of existence, of seeing everything as a source of suffering. It's about seeing everything as a potential addiction and therefore maybe not worth getting involved with. So that's the first mark or characteristic of existence, is that all dharmas are characterized by producing suffering. Number two, all dharmas, all phenomena should be seen and or understood as being impermanent. The thing about this one, by the way, impermanence is one of those things where all we see all the time, everywhere, is impermanence, change. But man, do we hold on to things hoping they won't change. And then when they reveal their impermanent, changing nature, like we knew they would, we get all upset. Even though we have never seen anything last. So there's this reality, there's this things as they really are, which is that they are impermanent. And we see it, we know it, but there's a part of us that clings with the hope of not this time, not this one. And so seeing things as they really are is just that of of like you see it, you see the impermanence everywhere. Get into it in that way. So wisdom, prajñā, is about understanding that things cause suffering, understanding that they're impermanent. And the third mark of existence, and this is the wildest one, and I'm going to do my best to explain it. It's the characteristic that in the experience of any phenomena, there's actually no self there experiencing that phenomena. So it's the characteristic of no self, anatta. But what exactly does that mean? So let me put it to you this way. We come at this all different angles every Sunday night. So right now, for me, there could be this idea that I'm talking. There could also be this idea that I'm thinking. So notice that there's this idea of a doer of the talking. The basic idea, and I'm really simplifying it, but the basic idea is that there is talking. There is talking, but the idea that there is somebody talking, that's maybe where there's a little bit of confusion going on. Or the idea that there is thought, but the idea that there's a thinker. And the thing about the thinker, a funny thing about thinking is we think that we're the thinker, as if we could just think about whatever we want whenever we want. But what the Buddha points out is that if you were really that thinking, you would be able to have absolute autonomy and control over that thinking all the time. If it was really you thinking, there's just thoughts. But there's no thinker in that way. So what we're talking about, or how I would understand this, is that there's a very, very, it's a kind of a technical term in Buddhism. It's called upadana. Upadana is sometimes translated as clinging. It's sometimes translated as attachment. I like to translate it as appropriation. But the thing about it is that there is these thoughts, right? So there's this mind, right? But that mind, it has a habit. And the habit is that it looks at things and it goes, my phone, not a cell phone, my cell phone, my computer, right? My shirt. But then that appropriating mind, it also does it in terms of, oh, look, your hat. Oh, look, those are your glasses. So I kind of like, I appropriate for you in that way, right? But watch what happens though. The appropriating, this idea of, ooh, mine. The appropriating goes, oh, my hand, my arm, my body. And then it goes even further and it says, ooh, my voice. It appropriates the voice and says, my voice, my ideas, me, mine. And what we want to recognize from a Buddhist point of view is that selfing, appropriating it's like a habit. And the mind is in appropriation overdrive. And that's what I mean by it won't stop appropriating. So it goes like my body, my words, my thoughts, my whatever, my disease, my this and that. It wants to appropriate everything. And it's a habit. But the habit is fabricating the self that thinks it's underneath that. So that's truly delusional. It's a delusion in that way. So that delusion that is fabricated through appropriation, that delusion can be, it's like the Buddhists describe it as a stain on the mind. And we can remove the stain of appropriation and selfing. And the thing about it is, and this is where I always try to get people really excited by that idea. The thing about it is that self, even though I know because of the appropriation, that self is the most dear thing to us. But the thing about it is that appropriating self, all that is suffering. All that is the opportunity for suffering. And in other words, if you hear it from me or you hear it from any Buddhist teacher or the Buddha himself, when you hear about this teaching of no self, I would really strongly encourage you to hear that as getting rid of all of the gunk and all of the suffering. And what remains is a Buddha. In other words, I know that when we hear this teaching of no self, we can be like, oh, but I like myself. But I don't want to give up myself. And I encourage you to give it up because all we're talking about is the clinging. All we're talking about is the appropriating. That's all that is. And when that is removed, it's not that you disappear in that way, is what I'm getting at. And I know that there's a sort of a kind of a nihilistic fantasy that no self means, I don't even know, like you disappear or something. And it's like, no, you're free. You're liberated at that point. So, okay. Noe, question, comment, idea?
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
It's integrated. There's no self. Boom.
Boom.
What? What? You mean that this entire existence is right here, right now?
That's what we're talking about.
It's not transcending, it's integrating. It's
Beautiful.
not denying and being a nihilist. It's like integrate.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Excellent, Noe. Yay. And so, with those three characteristics of understanding wisely that external things in a way cause suffering, they're impermanent anyways, which is probably why they cause suffering, and there's ultimately really no self there experiencing that thing to begin with. That is what constitutes wisdom, at least in the early form of Buddhism. And so now we want to take a step back over to the meditation portion of this. And so Robin's question about how should the body and how should the world be seen? Is it good, bad, or neutral? Well, according to the early Buddhist tradition, it's basically bad. And you should develop what they call disenchantment with it all. You should not be enchanted by it in that way. So, Robin, I would suggest that that early Hinayana form of Buddhism had a very kind of negative attitude towards the world as a cause of suffering. I would suggest that the more mainstream Mahayana Bodhisattva type of Buddhism is moving much more towards neutrality, that it's about that the external world and whatever's going on in my body, it's not good or bad. Those are sort of human, all too human decisions, and it just is. I don't even know if I'd call that neutral in that way, rather than like just is. We could call it neutral or equanimous or something like that. And then I might even go so far as to say that the third turning of the Vajrayana would actually want us to see it all as good. I would might even go that far, that that's sort of the idea. And that can get tricky though. That can get a little tricky in terms of seeing certain things in this world as good. That can be, and that's why the Vajrayana gets itself into a little trouble every now and then. Because if we're going to go for it's all good, then it's all good. So, so regarding that threefold division of Buddhism into the early form, mainstream Mahayana, and advanced Vajrayana, because of those differences in attitude and disposition towards the world, it changes the way meditation works. In other words, the early schools of Buddhism, like that early Theravada Hinayana type of Buddhism, it was really, like I said, into sensory deprivation. It wanted you to shut off your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and then ultimately wanted you to shut the brain down so that you basically like unplug the computer and then plug it back in. But the early form of Buddhism was this ultra, um, it was about nirodha, cessation, but absolute cessation of all karmic activity. In the more mainstream Mahayana Bodhisattva type of Buddhism, the definition of prajñā, the definition of wisdom changes. The focus is now on the teaching of emptiness, not so much impermanence, but emptiness. It's too late in the evening for me to start a whole emptiness talk, so we're not going to get into that tonight. But the basic teaching of emptiness, well, it ultimately, of course, is kind of saying that because things are kind of delusional, they actually don't really exist as tangible phenomena. And if they don't really exist as tangible phenomena that way, they're not actually quite impermanent because there's actually nothing to be impermanent. There is, it is just that emptiness in that way. So that emptiness now becomes sort of the focus of the Mahayana Bodhisattva meditation, where it's sort of whether your eyes are opened or your eyes are closed, the meditation is not so much about the impermanent suffering nature of things, but about the empty nature of things. Now, the most important thing I can tell you about meditating on emptiness and that kind of Mahayana path, what you can't do, you have to promise me you won't do this. You can't come to an understanding of the empty nature of all phenomena, but not apply that to the meditator who thinks they understand that. It's either all empty or you're doing impermanence, suffering, Hinayana stuff. But if you're really meditating on emptiness, you have to keep this constantly in mind that it's all empty, including the one who would think they even understand that. I say this because, and it's kind of from not my own personal experience, but from working with people as kind of a coach. If you successfully understand the emptiness of all things, but you don't apply it to you, that is a recipe for loneliness, sadness, depression, nihilism, you name it. It is a huge misunderstanding to think that there is a perceiver of emptiness or someone who understands emptiness. Don't do that. So it's either meditate on this teaching of emptiness and it cuts through everything, or again, maybe do a more Hinayana type of meditation. So, what I'm getting around to again is that depending upon the type of Buddhism, the definition of wisdom, the definition of prajñā changes, which means the meditation changes, and this can have implications for Shila, for the morality. But in general, the morality stays fairly consistent across schools of Buddhism, meaning the precepts are the precepts. And unless you want to get into some minutia where certain schools do certain things one way and other schools do things another way, the main precepts are the same for all forms of Buddhism. So, okay, questions, comments, ideas about anything? I know I've thrown a lot of different ideas out there tonight. We finally have now kind of covered the three aspects of Buddhism. Again, this is traditionally what makes Buddhism Buddhism. And just to repeat something I said last week, but I don't know if I put it quite this way. I just mentioned that I do this kind of coaching, kind of Buddhist counseling or Buddhist coaching. So one thing that I hear a lot as a coach that way is people who are struggling with their meditation practice, struggling focusing, struggling getting through the whole session, all kinds of stuff. And one of my first questions is usually, how's your Shila? How's the morality going? Often for people, that's not a part of their Buddhism. They're like a meditator. They're a serious meditator, and maybe they read some sutras, read a little Buddhist philosophy. So they do a little prajñā and they do a little, you do a lot of meditation. But as far as the precepts go, it's not part of their life. They try to be a good person, maybe, they try not to kill, right? But the idea is that if you're not working on that part of it, the Shila, don't be surprised if you're having trouble understanding Buddhism, like the wisdom, or you're having trouble concentrating in meditation. It's why I wanted to present it this way, because it's a beautiful system in that sense. And again, it has so much to do with psychology, has so much to do with the Buddha understanding how the mind works, or how Buddhism understands the mind working. So that's why I really wanted to go through all three of those in depth. Any remaining comments, ideas, questions, insights, realizations?
Just a reminder, if you want to raise your hand or just wave at the camera, we will help unmute you.
Yeah. Maria, got something?
Oh, I just thought I'd take this opportunity to say that I had a sort of similar moment around my appreciation for my meditation practice when I couldn't meditate. I couldn't sit because I was super sick. And yeah, so when I was able to come back to it, it was just like, oh, such a relief. And I, missed it so much. And this is always reinforced by any of a lot of the Tibetan teachings that I read are always hammering home the point that this is a precious human birth. This is your opportunity, the opportunity. And, all I have to do is look at the world and have a little bit of gratitude for my opportunity to practice, to sit in safety and all the stuff around that. So, yep. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent comment, Maria. Any other thoughts? Noe?
Oh, thank you, Maria.
Yeah.
I just want to interject. I was really sick also, and what I found in a moment was I couldn't stop my mind. As much as I tried, my mind, it was anything. I couldn't stop breathing. So it was really nice to come to that realization in the middle of lying on the floor going, "Oh, this is what death looks like. I am not going to, I have no control, no power. It's going to do what it's going to do." Um, but I remembered a little chant that someone gave me, and I did it, and I was able to get up off the floor. So still here. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marie.
Jordan?
Hey everyone.
Hey,
Good
welcome
to
back.
see all of you. Thanks. Um, yeah, just kind of a couple comments. One thing I've realized with time and like trying to stick with the practice is how important sticking to the precepts is for the practice. And that's something I've learned over time. Like sometimes it can just force me to not even want to meditate, you know, and it's a big realization I've been having recently. But another thing I wanted to say was I was just staying in a monastery in Thailand, and um, the nun and the monk that were teaching us, I kind of asked them when I was leaving, like, what do you guys recommend for like a daily practice? And they were like, it's not about that. It's about being mindful 24/7. And that's something that, I wanted to share because it's something that I took away. It's not just about being on the cushion. So that was I just wanted to chime in and share that with you guys. And it's good to be back and see all of you. So thanks.
It's great to see you, Jordan. And excellent, excellent comment. Excellent couple of comments, but definitely that. I mean, I even have a note here. I don't know when it came up, but I was gonna say something similar regarding meditation as far as like we sort of set aside these periods of time to like really focus and practice. But yeah, there should be no uh, reason to not be practicing in a way, no matter what, in that sense. Um, yeah, I couldn't agree with the Thai advice anymore. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, awesome. All right, everybody. Well, then I think on that lovely note, I will call it a night. Oh, yep, I'm going to be here every Sunday doing this kind of informal discussion of Buddhism. I'm going to be up in San Francisco on Saturday, February 21st for a half-day workshop. And that's going to be on the very interesting topic of Buddhism and gender. So I'm looking forward to doing that. That's going to be from 1 to 4 p.m. up at San Francisco Dharma Collective. And then I'm going to be starting a new sutra study class in March. That's on March 3rd. That's going to be on Tuesday nights. And it's going to be an 8-week course on a couple of different Mahayana sutras, some serious Bodhisattva path type sutra. So you can sign up for the sutra study class of mine over at my website, lotusunderground.com. And you can sign up for the workshop at SFDC at the SFDC website.